Now, the process of selecting objects from a group is very similar for physical and digital collections. The major difference is that many formats that may exist within a digital collection and the many formats that potential personally identifiable information may exist within a digital collection as well. So I'm going to begin with the file format side of things because this is probably one of the most discussed aspect of digital collection management. How do we deal with these different formats, and what if they become obsolete? I personally think that the discussion here around format obsolescence is a little bit alarmist, but it's still useful to explore these things. So um, let's talk about this more generally. Every file has a format. We've talked about that. And that format is a set of rules that determines how the contained information was encoded into bytes and therefore how it can be decoded by a piece of software so that you can actually understand what the information is. Now, in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of different competing companies with similar kinds of software. And they all pushed their own file formats because they wanted to differentiate their product or lock in their customers or any of 1,000 reasons. Very rarely could one piece of software decode formats created for a different piece of software. And as a result, there's probably tens or hundreds of thousands of file formats. Here I have a list of some old word processing programs, and there's a lot. This is only a very small subset of them before 2010. It includes things you might recognize, but also things you've never heard of because, you know, somebody put out a product, the company failed, but that software is still around. You could still buy that stuff and use it. However, in modern computing, software companies don't really fight with file formats anymore. They actually kind of want to make it easy as possible to get your information into and out of their software, or they've come to such market dominance that they don't have to fight, they just exist. So as a result, we've seen a drastic decrease in the number of file formats in use. Think about how many different file formats you've worked with in the past year. It's probably less than 100. It might even be less than 20. I was trying to come up with a list of common word processing programs that have been in use since 2010. And I mean, really, Microsoft Word, Google Docs, and maybe Apple Pages. That's about it. However, um, if you do work with more specialized kinds of digital data, well, then you might actually work with less common formats that other people have never heard about. So, just as an example of this, the medical field has this format called the DICOM format. And the DICOM format, it works a lot like any other image format, but it's been specialized a little bit for medical imaging, like x-rays and CAT scans and things like that. And can hold metadata that helps medical software process these kinds of images. And yeah, when you go into a hospital, into their IT setting, they have huge amounts of infrastructure devoted to handling these types of images and only these types of images. If you were to launch a new kind of medical imaging device that wasn't able to create a DICOM file, like you might have a harder time actually selling that device. So yeah, there are still formats that are relatively, they seem kind of strange, kind of weird, but then you go into that field and you discover that, oh, there's millions and billions of dollars that help support and make this thing a useful thing. And this is not actually a rare format, it's a very common thing, just in a specific place. So the current situation, if you were working with selecting from digital files, is that if the collection is relatively recent and the user didn't do very specialized things, you're probably going to see formats that you recognize: mp4, docx, pdf, jpeg, etc. And those are going to be easy to view and to process. But if the files are created by someone who's working in a very specific industry, well, now you might not recognize those formats. DWG, CR2, PSD, NIFTI, OBJ. Like, you might recognize some of these, you might not recognize others. They're all from very different kinds of fields, and you're probably going to need some specialized software in order to actually open these things up and view them and make retention decisions. And if the files are relatively older, again, you're going to run into the problem of formats you don't recognize. DOC, RM, AIFF, BMP. We can make very long lists of these things, but the key point is that in order to be able to open those things up, well, you'll need specialized software, but even harder, you'll need old software that might be hard to get a track of. You'll need an old operating system potentially. You might need an old computer or other equipment to actually get this older thing running to be able to look at it. And that can be very difficult. So the question then becomes, what do you do when you see this kind of stuff? And there's a couple of strategies that you can use. Number one, you can use the context of the file. You can use the file name, the folder name, to figure out what is this thing, and is this thing something I might want to keep, even if I can't view the contents, because maybe somebody else can at some other point. You could also research that specific format to understand what the contents might be and use that to help with your retention decision. Or you can just take a very broad brush and retain lots of things under the understanding that, well, you're not exactly sure, but you'd rather retain than to get rid of things because a file format, like just because you are unable to render a file format doesn't mean that it's not content that might be important towards your collection. So for example, here we have a context example. You can see here DWG. If you don't know what DWG is, it's a file format used by AutoCAD, a computer-aided design software. But when you look at these file names and you look at that folder name, sample DWGs, well, very clearly these are probably not the most interesting files. They're probably just sample files. They're not something that you want to keep around. So, okay, fine. Based on that information, we don't need to retain these files. Similarly, you might come across a packet like this. Now, a lot of very kind of system-looking file names and folder names, a lot of all caps stuff, very confusing. What in the world is it? But if you start looking for some of these more confusing acronyms like BDMV, you'll find out that this thing is a Born Digital movie package, and all of these files and folders are actually kind of critical for storing various things about high definition video. This came off of a camera all packaged like this, and probably the best retention decision is to retain every single one of these files and folders in the context that they are, not to like split it up or do any additional stuff. Even if you don't understand what some of these files do, like index.bdmv, I couldn't tell you what that does, but better that I just keep all of it than I make smaller decisions to say, like, I just want the video. Let's try and figure out where the video file is. Finally, you can use things like very broad stroke decisions. Here I have a rendering of a looking at how much storage space is used for various files and folders on a Windows machine. And you can see here, 18.33 gigabytes, the vast majority is used by Windows, the operating system. You probably don't want a copy of Windows. You probably don't want a copy of the program files. You probably want a lot of the data that's in users, because that's where things like the documents folder is, the videos folder, the desktop folder, the downloads folder, etc. That's probably the thing that you care about the most. All these other things are all system files and are not going to be likely homes of content that you really care about if you're going in there and trying to like really identify things that you want. So with these types of decision-making processes, you're limiting the amount of material that you're committing to preserve in the long term. And that's a good idea to do because it limits the amount of money that you have to pay to store this stuff. It also limits the potential impact of personally identifiable information that you might want to have inside of your collection.